My name is Callie Marsh. I'm 37 years old, and I built something from nothing with my hands and about 9 years of my life that I'll never get back. 3 weeks before my brother's engagement party, my mother called me and asked me, very sweetly, not to mention what I do for a living. She said the Hargrove family was refined. She said it might be uncomfortable. She said, just for one evening, couldn't I be flexible? What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because she'd stopped paying attention to me sometime around the year my father died, was that the man she was so desperate to impress had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to get me on the phone. And that the only reason I hadn't called him back was because I was too busy running the company he wanted to buy. Welcome to Beyond the Headlights, where we talk about the long roads, the dark stretches, and the moments that change everything. If you've ever been told to make yourself smaller so someone else could look bigger, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me who actually saw you when everyone else looked away. And subscribe, because the road ahead of this one matters too. Let me back up to the beginning, because you need to understand what I was before that party, and what I'd built, and why my mother's request landed the way a tire iron lands on pavement. Loud, cold, unmistakable. My father, Dale Marsh, drove an 18-wheeler for 23 years. He drove for a regional outfit out of Knoxville that hauled steel coil and manufactured goods across a 7-state corridor. He was not a wealthy man. He was a careful man, and there is a difference. He maintained his rig obsessively, kept his logbook clean, ran on time, and came home on Fridays smelling like diesel and coffee, and the particular kind of tired that only comes from holding a steering wheel for 9 hours in the rain. I rode with him the summer I turned 14, 2 weeks of running loads between Tennessee and Ohio, while my mother stayed home with my younger brother, Connor, who was 11, and convinced that trucking was not a career but a sentence. My mother agreed with Connor. She believed, with the quiet ferocity of a woman who'd grown up poor in a house with a leaky roof, that education was the only ladder worth climbing, and that any ladder with grease on it would drop you back where you started. What she didn't count on was that I loved it. I loved the pre-trip inspection, the ritual of it, the way my father moved around that cab with the deliberate attention of someone who understood that the machine and the man were partners. I loved the radio chatter, and the way the landscape opened up flat and wide past Lexington. I loved the math of it, the load weights, the fuel calculations, the hours of service regulations that required a mind that could hold multiple variables without flinching. I was not supposed to be a truck driver. I was supposed to get a degree and move somewhere that wasn't Knoxville and become something my mother could describe to the neighbors without having to explain. Then, when I was 24, my father had a stroke behind the wheel on I-75 southbound. The rig caught the shoulder and stopped against the guardrail. He was alive. He was, the doctors said, going to stay alive. But the left side of his body had gone quiet in a way it would not recover from, and the truck that he owned, the single truck that was his livelihood and ours, was sitting in an impound lot in Jellicoe, Tennessee, accruing $52 a day in storage fees. My mother did not know how to get it out. My brother was 13. My father's insurance covered his medical expenses, but not his income, and the mortgage on the house in North Knoxville was $1,140 a month. I got my CDL in 6 weeks. I drove my father's truck for the next 4 years. I want you to understand the specific texture of that decision because people hear it and they think it sounds noble, and maybe it was, but it also just sounded like arithmetic. The truck existed. The route existed. The house payment existed. I was the only variable that was free to move, so I moved. I didn't think of it as sacrifice. I thought of it as a spreadsheet with one obvious solution. That habit of mind, the ability to see a problem as a structure rather than a tragedy, is the thing my father gave me. It is also, I would learn much later, the thing that was going to save me in a ballroom in East Tennessee on a Saturday evening in October, in front of 60 people, while my mother tried to make me disappear. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For 4 years, I ran my father's route and kept the house afloat. I sent my mother $2,000 a month, covered my brother's school clothes and his phone, and eventually his first semester's tuition at the University of Tennessee. I drove in the dark and ate in diners and listened to audiobooks about logistics, about fleet management, about the economics of freight. I was not planning a business. I was just learning the way you learn when driving is the only time you have to think. In year 3, I had a conversation at a truck stop in London, Kentucky, with a dispatcher named Gwen who ran a small brokerage operation out of her cousin's spare bedroom and was drowning in paperwork. She had more loads than she had carriers. I had a truck, a clean record, and too much time between loads. I started taking her overflow. I bought a second truck with a loan I had no business qualifying for and found a driver willing to work for a fair split. I kept my mouth shut and my books cleaner than they needed to be. By the time I was 28, I had 4 trucks. By 32, I had 11. By 35, I had the company I have now. Marsh Freight Solutions, 22 units, 12 full-time drivers, a dispatch operation out of a converted office building near the airport, and contracts with 3 regional manufacturers that together represented just over $4.2 million in annual revenue. I did not tell my mother any of this, not because I was hiding it, because she never asked. She knew I drove trucks. She knew I was, in her words, doing fine. She assumed fine meant what it meant for a truck driver, steady, not spectacular, the kind of living that pays the bills without requiring anyone to be impressed. She stopped asking about my work sometime around the year Connor graduated college. That was fine with me. I had learned, by then, that there are 2 kinds of people who ask how you're doing, the ones who want to know, and the ones who want confirmation that their assumption was correct. My mother was the second kind, and I had stopped offering her information that contradicted her picture. My brother, Connor, had graduated with a degree in business administration and gone to work in commercial real estate. He was good at it. He was charming and organized, and he wore suits that fit him correctly, and he'd been dating a woman named Brianna Hargrove for 3 years by the time he called me to say he was going to propose. The Hargroves were not from Knoxville. They were from Nashville, old Nashville, the kind of family that had a last name on a building at Vanderbilt and a vacation house on Norris Lake that had been in the family since before the reservoir was built. Brianna's father, Owen Hargrove, had taken his grandfather's modest trucking operation, 3 flatbeds, a 1-room office, and built it into Hargrove Logistics, one of the largest privately held freight companies in the southeastern United States. I knew who Owen Hargrove was. I'd known for years. His company was the kind of company I studied the way a musician studies the work of someone 20 years ahead of them. I had received, over the course of the previous 18 months, 3 separate inquiries from a Hargrove Logistics Acquisitions coordinator asking whether Marsh Freight Solutions would consider a meeting to discuss a potential partnership or purchase. I had not returned the calls, not because I wasn't interested, but because I wasn't ready, and I have learned that the worst time to negotiate is when you need the deal. I did not know, when Connor told me about the engagement, that the man I had not called back was the man whose daughter was going to marry my brother. I found out the night my mother called to talk about the party. The call came on a Tuesday evening. I was at my desk going over fuel cost variance for the month. My mother's voice came through the phone warm and orchestrated, the way it always is when she wants something and has decided in advance that I might refuse. Callie, honey, the engagement party is the 14th. The Hargroves are going to be there, all of them. Owen and Patricia, Brianna's grandmother, her brother and his wife. It's going to be lovely. And I've been thinking, it might be easier on everyone if we kept things simple in terms of how we introduce you. I asked her what that meant. She said it meant she'd been telling the Hargroves that her daughter was in transportation management, which was technically true, she said, quickly, before I could say anything. You do manage a transportation operation. I said, Mom, I own a freight company. I have 22 trucks. She said, I know that, sweetheart, but the Hargroves are very polished people, and I just think you know how it sounds. Truck driver. It sounds like what? It sounds rough. She paused. Owen Hargrove built a whole empire, and the family is very accomplished. I just don't want you to feel out of place. I understood then. She wasn't trying to protect me. She was trying to protect the image she'd been performing for 3 months to people she desperately wanted to impress. An image in which she was the kind of mother whose children were refined and professional and didn't carry the smell of diesel in their history. She told them her daughter was in transportation management, and she needed that to hold for one evening. I thought about telling her everything. About the company, about Owen Hargrove's acquisition inquiries, about the $4.2 million in annual revenue. I thought about it, and I set it down. I said, "I'll be there, Mom." She said, relieved, "Just keep it vague if anyone asks. You don't need to get into specifics." I said, "I'll be professional." She seemed satisfied. She moved on to talking about the caterer. I set the phone down on the desk and looked at the fuel variance report and thought about what my father used to say when a load came back overweight and had to be rebalanced. "You don't argue with the scale, Cal. You redistribute the weight until it reads right. Then you roll." I had been redistributing weight my entire life. That evening, I decided I was done. The party was at a venue called the Carriage House, a restored property in West Knoxville that was the kind of place that cost $3,000 for 4 hours and came with its own event coordinator who used the word curated approximately once every 6 minutes. Connor had reserved it for 60 guests. My mother had organized the flowers and the catering. She had sent me a dress code, cocktail attire, neutral tones. I wore a charcoal blazer over a dark silk blouse and trousers. It was not a dress. My mother had texted me the morning of the party to say she hoped I'd found something nice, which was her way of asking whether I'd worn something she'd be comfortable with. I had. I did not tell her about the shoes, Italian leather, the kind that take 4 months to break in and last 20 years, because she would not have understood that I'd bought them with the first check I'd written myself as the owner of a company rather than an employee of one. Some things you carry for yourself, not for show. I arrived at 6:15. The room was already warm with the low noise of 60 people who didn't know each other well enough to be comfortable. I spotted my mother immediately. She was near the bar with a woman in pale green whom I assumed was Patricia Hargrove, and she was laughing a half-second too loud. The laugh she uses when she's performing for an audience she hasn't won yet. Connor found me near the door. He looked like himself, slightly too happy, the way he always does when he's in a room full of people who are impressed by him. He hugged me and said I looked great. I told him congratulations and meant it. I do love my brother. I want you to understand that throughout everything that follows. He is not cruel. He is a man who learned, growing up, that the simplest path through a room was to agree with whoever held it, and he had been agreeing with my mother for 30 years. That is a character flaw, not a moral failing. The difference matters. He introduced me to Brianna, who was beautiful and sharp-eyed and who said, when she shook my hand, that she'd heard so much about me. Then she said something that I filed away and didn't examine until later. She said, "My dad's been hopping to meet you." I asked what she meant. She smiled, a little cryptic, and got pulled away by her grandmother before she could answer. I found a spot near the windows and watched the room. I noticed Owen Hargrove before my mother introduced us, because he was the kind of man you notice, not from height or loudness, but from the specific quality of stillness he carried. He was maybe 62, broad through the shoulders, with the hands of someone who had spent time doing physical work before the work became organizational. He stood with a glass of water, not wine, and he was listening to a man talk with the particular attention of someone who is deciding whether the conversation is worth continuing. When my mother brought him to me 20 minutes later, she said, "Owen, this is my daughter, Callie. She's in transportation management. She oversees logistics operations." Owen Hargrove looked at me for a moment before he said anything. Not the polite glance of cocktail party introduction, a real look. Then he said, without any warmth leaving his voice, not even close to accusatory, "Callie Marsh." I said, "That's me." He said, "Marsh Freight Solutions." My mother's smile froze in a very specific way that I recognized. It was the smile that holds while the mind behind it recalculates. I said, "Yes." He said, "I've had 3 people try to get you on the phone for the better part of 2 years." I said, "I know, I wasn't ready for the conversation." He looked at me for another moment, and then he did something I hadn't expected. He laughed, a real one, short and genuine. He said, "That's the most honest thing anyone said to me at a party in about 6 years." My mother said, very carefully, "You two know each other." Owen said, "We don't, but I know her company." I said I did. There was a silence in which I watched my mother try to reconstruct the evening around a piece of information she had not known was in the room. The daughter she'd told him was in transportation management was, it turned out, the owner of a freight company his acquisition team had been pursuing for 18 months. The woman she'd asked to keep things vague had a name that his people had been trying to reach. I watched her understand this. I did not help her understand it. I have spent my entire adult life helping my mother navigate the consequences of information she hadn't bothered to gather, and I was done with that particular service. Owen said to me, "You want to talk actual business at some point tonight, or is that wrong for the room?" I said, "Give me until after the toast. The evening belongs to Connor and Brianna." He said, "Fair enough," and he excused himself to find his wife. My mother turned to me. Her face had gone through several expressions and settled on something I recognized as damage control. She said, "You should have told me." I said quietly, "You should have asked." She started to say something else. I said, "Mom, the toast is in 20 minutes, let's talk after." She pressed her lips together and went to check on the caterer. Here is what I want to tell you about that next hour, because it's the part that people skip over in these kinds of stories. The part where nothing dramatic is happening but everything is changing. I stood near the windows with a glass of sparkling water, and I thought about the 10 years between my father's stroke and this room. I thought about the specific arithmetic of what I had built. 22 trucks, 12 drivers, 3 manufacturer contracts, $4.2 million in annual revenue, a dispatch office near the airport with a whiteboard that still had my handwriting on it from the planning session where we landed the 3rd contract. I thought about the $2,000 a month I'd sent home for 8 years. I did the math standing there and came to $192,000, and the tuition payments that came to another $34,000. I had never said those numbers out loud. I had not even written them down. They existed the way all background facts exist, present, structural, invisible. I thought about my mother telling Patricia Hargrove that her daughter was in transportation management. I thought about the word management, the careful distancing it did, the way it lifted the work away from the physical, the diesel, the dirt under the fingernails, and placed it somewhere that felt acceptable in a room full of people in cocktail attire. I thought about my father, who would have laughed, not cruelly, just with the specific amusement of a man who understood that the work he did was the reason rooms like this one existed, and that the people in rooms like this one rarely understood that, and that this was not, in the end, their fault or his problem. I decided, standing there, that I was not going to create a scene. I was not going to correct my mother in front of 60 people. I was not going to perform a revelation for the room. I was going to simply be what I was, clearly and without apology, and let the room find its own level. That is a quieter kind of decision than the kind people expect, but it is the kind that holds. Connor's toast was lovely. He talked about meeting Brianna at a work conference and being so nervous he spilled coffee on her presentation notes, and she'd laughed instead of being annoyed, and he'd known, right then, that she was the one. He talked about her patience and her sharpness, and the way she called him on his nonsense without ever making him feel small. He said he hoped to spend his whole life learning how to deserve her. I believed him. I drank to them. I meant it. Then Brianna's father spoke. Owen Hargrove did not stand up with notes. He was not the kind of man who wrote things down for an audience. He said that he had built his company, starting with the 3 trucks his grandfather left him, by learning 2 things: how to pick the right load and how to pick the right people. He said that what he liked about Connor was that Connor was honest about what he didn't know, which was rare, and that he'd spent his career finding out that the most dangerous people in any room are the ones who won't admit what they don't know. He said that he'd had an interesting conversation that evening with someone he'd been trying to meet for a while. He looked at me across the room, not for drama, just because he was a man who looked at the thing he was talking about. He said, Callie Marsh runs Marsh Freight Solutions out of Knoxville, 22 units, 12 drivers, clean safety record, strong contracts. She's been operating for 9 years and she built it from a single inherited truck while her father was recovering from a stroke. He paused. I've been trying to get her to take a meeting for about 18 months. She told me tonight she wasn't ready before. He raised his glass. I'm glad she is now. 60 people looked at me. I am a person who has driven alone in the dark for hundreds of hours, who has negotiated contracts and managed payroll and argued with mechanics, and held a company together through 2 recessions and a global logistics crisis. I have not cried in a professional setting since my father's funeral. I did not cry then, but something loosened in my chest that I had been holding so long I had forgotten it had a name. I raised my glass back. I said, "Thank you, Owen." And the room moved on, the way rooms do, back to conversation and refilled glasses and the particular hum of an evening that is going well. Except for my mother. I found her near the bar 10 minutes later. She was holding a glass of white wine, and her face had the particular stillness of a woman who has just understood that the ground she was standing on was not the ground she thought it was. I sat next to her. I did not open with anger, because anger would have made this about my feelings, and I wanted it to be about facts. I said, "I've been sending you $2,000 a month for 8 years. I covered Connor's tuition. I built the company that Owen Hargrove just described while I was also paying your mortgage shortfalls and your car insurance gap and the HVAC replacement 3 years ago. I did all of that without telling you what it cost me, and I did it because you were family and Dad couldn't work, and somebody had to be the one who held it." She said, very quietly, "I didn't know the company was that." I said, "You didn't ask. That's different from not knowing. You didn't ask because you decided what I was, and asking would have risked finding out you were wrong." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I just didn't want them to think." I said, "That your daughter drives trucks." She didn't answer. I said, "Dad drove trucks for 23 years. And everything we have, your house, Connor's degree, every piece of it, came from what he built and what I kept running after he couldn't. I know what that work means to you, Mom. I know it looks like the thing you were trying to get away from. But I'm not going to stand in a room and let you tell people I'm something vague because the real thing makes you uncomfortable." She said, "The Hargroves." I said, "The Hargroves built their fortune on freight. Owen's grandfather ran 3 flatbeds. He just stood up in front of 60 people and said my name. He didn't find it embarrassing." She looked at her glass for a long time. Then she said, and I give her credit for this, that it took her something to say it. "I've been afraid for so long of being seen as the wrong kind of person that I stopped being able to see the right kind." I let that sit between us. I said, "I'm going to take the meeting with Owen. It'll probably change my company significantly. You'll read about it eventually, maybe in a trade publication. I want you to hear it from me first, and I want you to know that whatever comes next, I am not hiding it." She nodded, once small. I said, "I also want to talk, sometime, about the money. Not to make you feel bad, just because I think we should both know what we're actually talking about when we talk about what I've done for this family." She nodded again. I stood up, smoothed my trousers, and went to find Owen Hargrove. We talked for 40 minutes in a quiet corner near the door while the party moved around us. We talked about load capacity and route density and what a partnership structure might look like versus an acquisition. He was direct and specific, the way people who have built something real always are. He did not waste time. I appreciated that in a way I hadn't expected to. At the end, he said, "You should have called me back." I said, "I know. I wanted to be further along." He said, "You were further along than you thought." I said, "That's usually how it works." He smiled. His wife appeared at his elbow, Patricia, the woman my mother had been performing for all evening, and she shook my hand and said she'd heard Owen talk about my company and she was glad we'd finally connected. She said it simply, without theater, the way someone says a true thing. I drove home that night on I-40 West with the windows down a little. The air was cold and sharp and smelled like October. I thought about the 14-year-old who had ridden shotgun in her father's rig and understood. in the clean language of the road, that the work you do either means something or it doesn't, and that no one else gets to decide which. My father taught me that. He taught me by example, the way the best things get taught, not explained, just demonstrated, day after day, over hundreds of thousands of miles, in the dark and the rain and the long flat straightaways that go on longer than you think they will but always, eventually, open up. Here is how things settled, because I know you want to know. The Hargrove Logistics Partnership formalized 6 months after that party. Not an acquisition, I wasn't ready to sell, and Owen was smart enough not to push it. A strategic partnership. Marsh Freight as a preferred carrier for a portion of Hargrove's regional manufacturing contracts, with an option to revisit the acquisition conversation in 3 years. The contract represents approximately $1.1 million in additional annual revenue, and the kind of operational stability that lets me think about growth rather than survival. My mother and I have talked twice since the party. Real conversations, not performances. She asked me in the second one what it had actually cost me, the money, the years. I told her. She was quiet for a long time. She didn't apologize, not exactly. But she said, I should have paid attention. And from her, that is a significant sentence. Connor called me the week after the party and asked if he could take me to dinner. Just us, no agenda. We went to a place near downtown and he asked me, really asked me, in the way he hadn't since we were kids, what the company was like and how I'd built it and what the hardest years were. I talked for an hour. He listened. At the end, he said he hadn't known. I told him I knew that. I told him it wasn't entirely his fault, that I had kept a lot of it quiet, and that I wasn't interested in relitigating the past. I was interested in being actually known by the people in my life going forward. He said he'd like that. I believed him. I still do. Owen Hargrove, it turned out, had a photograph in his office. I saw it when I visited the Hargrove Logistics headquarters in Nashville for the partnership signing. It was framed behind his desk, black and white, slightly faded, 3 flatbed trucks in a line outside a depot somewhere in rural Tennessee. 3 trucks. The beginning. I recognized the picture the way you recognize something you've carried in your chest without knowing it had a shape. That's where it starts, that photograph says. Before the empire, before the building with the name on it, before the cocktail parties and the curated venues. It starts with a man and a truck and the willingness to keep driving when the road is dark and long and doesn't show you what's coming. I keep a photograph too. It's on my desk at the office, not framed, just propped against a coffee mug. My father and me, summer I turned 14, standing in front of his rig at a rest stop somewhere in Ohio. He's got his hand on my shoulder and we're both squinting into the sun and we're both unmistakably happy. I look at it when the numbers are hard, or the decisions are heavy, or someone in my life tries to make me feel like what I built is worth less than it is. It steadies me every time. Here's the only thing I'll tell you, and I'll tell it the way my father used to close a long run. Plainly, without embellishment, because the road was real enough on its own. The people who told you to dim yourself down were not protecting you. They were protecting their own picture of the world, a picture in which your brightness was an inconvenience. And you can love those people. I do, mostly, while also understanding that their picture was wrong, and that you do not owe your whole life to maintaining it. The woman my mother wanted me to be that night, vague, soft, careful not to take up too much room, would not have built anything. She would have stood in the corner and agreed with the most powerful person in the room and gone home the same size she arrived. I am not that woman. I never was. It just took me longer than it should have to stop pretending, in certain rooms, that I might be. Drive your own road. Keep the logbook honest. And don't let anybody tell you the headlights only reach as far as they can see. That's my story. If it reached something real in you, leave a comment and tell me about a moment you stopped making yourself small. Subscribe, because the roads we take next are worth talking about. And share this with the person in your life who's been the quiet one, carrying more than anyone knows. I'll see you beyond the headlights.